It is the morning of July 1st, 1916, near the river Somme in France. Thousands of British soldiers stand ready in the trenches, gripping their rifles with nervous anticipation. The artillery bombardment that has pounded the German lines for a week finally falls silent, leaving a heavy stillness in the air. Officers check their watches and blow their whistles, signaling the start of the attack. As the men climb up the wooden ladders and step into the open ground, they expect to find the enemy defenses destroyed. Instead, they hear the distinctive mechanical rattling of heavy machine guns. This sound marks the beginning of one of the darkest days in military history. The sound creates a rhythmic chattering that cuts through the morning mist with terrifying consistency. It is the sound of the Maskenengewehr 8, the German variant of the Maxim gun, firing 500 rounds every minute. The British troops walking forward in orderly lines are met not with scattered rifle fire, but with a solid wall of lead. The bullets tear through the air, creating a zone of death that no human courage can overcome. In mere moments, the optimism of the morning transforms into a chaotic slaughterhouse where bravery is rendered irrelevant by industrial efficiency. The machine gun has turned the open field into a killing ground where movement means almost certain death. This terrible moment marks the definitive end of 19th century warfare tactics and the brutal arrival of the 20th century. The romantic notion of the cavalry charge and the individual hero charging the enemy line is erased in seconds. Here on the Somme, the machine gun asserts its dominance over the battlefield with cold mechanical indifference. It does not tire, it does not feel fear, and it does not hesitate to kill. The soldiers facing this weapon are witnessing the culmination of decades of engineering focused entirely on the art of destruction. This is not just a battle between men, but a confrontation between flesh and a machine that has redefined the very nature of combat. The stakes of this conflict extend far beyond the muddy trenches of the Western Front. At risk is the future of Europe and the lives of millions of young men who have been mobilized for this great war. The military commanders on both sides are struggling to understand a weapon that breaks all previous rules of engagement. If they cannot find a way to overcome the defensive power of the machine gun, the war will stretch on indefinitely. Nations will bleed themselves dry as they throw wave after wave of soldiers against entrenched positions protected by these automatic weapons. The social and political fabric of the entire world hangs in the balance of this stalemate. Before this era, battles were often decided by maneuver and the spirited dash of troops across open ground. Commanders relied on speed and shock to break enemy formations and achieve victory. The machine gun completely neutralizes these traditional strategies by creating an impenetrable barrier of fire. A single crew operating one machine gun can pin down hundreds of enemy soldiers, effectively halting an entire offensive. The cost of gaining a few hundred yards of territory is now measured in thousands of lives lost. This technological shift forces armies to dig into the earth, creating the vast networks of trenches that scar the landscape from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea coast. To understand how this stalemate came to be, we must look back at the origins of this devastating technology. The concept of a gun that could fire rapidly was not entirely new, but previous attempts were clumsy and difficult to operate. The Gatling gun, for example, required a soldier to manually turn a crank to fire the weapon. This made it heavy, hard to aim, and prone to jamming in the heat of battle. The world was waiting for a true automatic weapon that could harness the energy of its own discharge to load and fire the next round. The man who would finally solve this engineering puzzle was an eccentric American inventor living in London. The protagonist of this technological revolution was a man named Hiram Stevens Maxim. Born in the state of Maine, he was a prolific genius who held patents on everything from hair-curling irons to mousetraps. However, his legacy would be defined by his pursuit of a weapon that could fire automatically without the need for hand cranking. Legend says a friend told him that if he wanted to make a fortune, he should invent something that would enable these Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility. Maxim took this advice to heart and moved to London to begin working on a design that utilized the energy of the recoil. Hiram Stevens Maxim realized that the kick or recoil of a rifle was essentially wasted energy. He designed a mechanism that used this rearward force to eject the spent cartridge and load a fresh one. This was a stroke of engineering brilliance that changed firearms forever. In 1884, he unveiled the Maxim gun to a group of skeptical military officials and dignitaries. The weapon was belt-fed and water-cooled, allowing it to fire continuously for long periods without overheating. When he pulled the trigger, the gun fired with a steady rhythm that amazed the onlookers. It was the first true automatic machine gun in history. The demonstration was a resounding success, and the implications were immediately clear to the military observers present. A single Maxim gun could deliver the same volume of fire as a platoon of riflemen, but required only a small crew to operate. The British Army eventually adopted the weapon, naming their version the Vickers gun. It was a robust and reliable piece of machinery that would become a staple of British infantry tactics. However, the British were not the only ones interested in this new power. The German Empire, with its focus on military modernization, also saw the potential of the Maxim design and purchased the rights to manufacture it. The Germans embraced the machine gun with a fervor that surpassed that of their British rivals. They developed the Maskenengewehr 8, which was a heavy and durable adaptation of the original Maxim design. By the time the war began in 1914, the German army had integrated thousands of these weapons into their infantry regiments. They trained elite crews to operate them and developed tactics specifically designed to maximize their defensive capabilities. While some British commanders still viewed the machine gun as a secondary support weapon, the Germans recognized it as the centerpiece of their defensive strategy. When the Great War erupted, the initial movements of the armies were still based on the old doctrines of open warfare. French soldiers marched into battle wearing bright red trousers, and British cavalry regiments prepared for glorious charges. However, as the armies clashed at the Battle of the Frontiers and the Battle of Mons, the reality of the machine gun became painfully apparent. Charges were cut down in seconds by the relentless hail of bullets. The open fields became death traps, and the armies were forced to seek cover. The shovel became as important as the rifle as soldiers dug into the earth to escape the withering fire. As the trench lines stabilized, the machine gun became the anchor of the defensive systems on both sides. The Germans in particular excelled at positioning their guns to create interlocking fields of fire. This meant that any attacking force would be hit from multiple angles, simultaneously leaving no blind spots for cover. They built concrete pillboxes and reinforced nests to protect the gun crews from artillery bombardments. These positions were often camouflaged, making them nearly invisible until the moment they opened fire. The geometry of the battlefield was now defined by the reach and angle of these deadly machines. The life of a machine gun crew was one of immense responsibility and constant danger. These men were priority targets for enemy snipers and artillery because silencing the gun was essential for any attack to succeed. A typical crew consisted of several men, including a firer, a loader, and others to carry ammunition and water. The guns were heavy and cumbersome, often weighing over 100 pounds with their mounts and cooling water. Moving them through the deep mud of the trenches was an exhausting ordeal that required immense physical strength. Yet the crew knew that their weapon was the only thing standing between their comrades and being overrun. One of the critical features of the Maxim-style guns was the water cooling jacket surrounding the barrel. The friction of firing hundreds of rounds a minute generated immense heat that could warp the metal barrel and cause the gun to fail. The water jacket kept the barrel cool, but the water would eventually boil off into steam. Crews had to constantly replenish the water supply, sometimes using urine when clean water was unavailable in the heat of battle. A flexible hose often led from the jacket to a condensing can to recycle the steam back into water. This system allowed the guns to fire for hours on end. The consumption of ammunition was another logistical challenge that defined the use of machine guns. A single gun could burn through thousands of rounds in a short engagement. The standard ammunition belts held 250 rounds, and a disciplined crew could reload a fresh belt in seconds. Behind the lines, supply trains and trucks worked tirelessly to bring millions of cartridges to the front. The floor of a machine gun nest would quickly become covered in a deep layer of hot brass casings. The sheer volume of lead being pumped into the air created a metallic storm that shredded trees and turned the earth into dust. Despite their mechanical reliability, the conditions of the trenches were brutal on the intricate moving parts of the guns. Mud, dirt, and grit were constant enemies that could cause the mechanism to jam at a critical moment. Crews spent hours meticulously cleaning and oiling their weapons to ensure they would function when needed. A jam during an enemy assault could mean death for the entire crew and a breach in the line. The bond between the gunner and his weapon was profound, as he relied on it for survival. They treated the machine with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The psychological impact of the machine gun on the soldiers was just as devastating as its physical effects. The distinctive sound of the gun firing created a sense of helplessness and dread. Veterans could distinguish between the slower thud of a Vickers and the rapid crack of a German MG-08. Knowing that a machine gun was trained on a specific area was enough to paralyze an entire platoon with fear. The suppression caused by the weapon forced men to keep their heads down, preventing them from returning fire or observing the enemy. It dominated the mental landscape of the soldier as much as the physical one. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 stands as a grim testament to the power of the machine gun. The German offensive was designed to bleed the French army white, and the machine gun was the primary instrument of this attrition. Wave after wave of French soldiers were thrown into the meat grinder, facing entrenched German positions. The landscape was churned into a lunar wasteland by artillery, but the machine gun nests often survived deep underground. When the shelling stopped, the German gunners would emerge to cut down the advancing infantry. The casualties were catastrophic on both sides. The question that haunted every general and strategist was how to break the stalemate created by these weapons. Traditional artillery barrages were used to destroy the barbed wire and machine gun nests before an attack. However, the Germans learned to protect their guns in deep dugouts, bringing them up only when the barrage lifted. This led to the tragedy of the Somme, where the British believed the enemy was destroyed, only to face intact machine guns. The failure of artillery to neutralize the threat forced commanders to look for other solutions. The cost of failure was simply too high to continue with the same tactics. Gas warfare was one horrific attempt to flush the defenders out of their trenches and away from their machine guns. Clouds of chlorine and mustard gas were released to drift across no man's land, choking and blinding the gun crews. While this caused panic and terrible suffering, it did not solve the tactical problem. Gas masks were developed and the machine guns continued to fire. The wind was unpredictable and gas could blow back on the attackers. It added another layer of misery to the war, but failed to break the dominance of the defensive firepower. As the war progressed, the design of machine guns began to evolve to meet the changing needs of the battlefield. The heavy water-cooled guns were excellent for defense, but too heavy for attacking troops to carry. This led to the development of light machine guns like the Lewis gun and the Chauchat. These weapons were air-cooled and fed by drums or magazines, making them portable enough to be carried by a single soldier. They allowed infantry squads to bring their own automatic firepower into the attack. This tactical shift began to restore some mobility to the battlefield. The Germans also adapted their tactics, developing the concept of the stormtrooper. These elite soldiers were trained to move in small, independent groups, bypassing strong points and infiltrating the enemy lines. Armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and submachine guns like the MP-18, they sought to neutralize the heavy machine gun nests from the flanks and rear. This infiltration tactic proved highly effective in the later stages of the war. It was a move away from the rigid lines of the past toward the fluid squad-based tactics that characterize modern warfare. However, the ultimate technological answer to the machine gun arrived in the form of the tank. First introduced by the British, the tank was an armored vehicle designed to crush barbed wire and cross trenches while being impervious to machine gun fire. The sight of these steel monsters slowly rolling across no man's land terrified the German defenders. Bullets that would have decimated an infantry wave simply bounced off the metal hull of the tank. The tank could drive right up to a machine gun nest and destroy it with its own cannons or machine guns. The Battle of Cambrai in 1917 demonstrated the potential of the tank to break the deadlock. Mass tanks punched through the German lines, opening a gap that infantry could exploit. While the early tanks were mechanically unreliable and slow, they represented the future of warfare. They provided the mobile protection that soldiers needed to survive the fire of the machine gun. The combination of tanks, artillery, and aircraft began to create the concept of combined arms warfare. This approach finally offered a way to overcome the static defense that had paralyzed the front. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, the machine gun had claimed millions of lives. It had forced the world to reimagine the way wars were fought and exposed the horrific potential of industrial technology. The generation that survived the trenches returned home with the sound of the gun etched into their memories. The weapon had proven that courage alone was no match for mechanical efficiency. The fields of Europe were silent once more, but they were filled with the graves of men who had walked into the fire. The legacy of the machine gun extends far beyond the First World War. It established the primacy of firepower in modern combat and dictated the development of military tactics for the next century. The principles of cover suppression and fire superiority that are taught to soldiers today all stem from the hard lessons learned in the trenches. The heavy water-cooled guns were eventually replaced by lighter air-cooled designs, but the fundamental concept remained the same. The ability to deliver rapid, sustained fire remains a cornerstone of infantry combat. Hiram Stevens Maxim died in 1916, while the war was still raging. He lived long enough to see his invention adopted by every major power, but perhaps not long enough to fully comprehend the scale of the tragedy it helped create. His name will forever be linked to the weapon that industrialized death. The machine gun stands as a dark monument to human ingenuity applied to the purpose of destruction. It is a reminder of how technology can outpace our moral and political ability to control it. Today, the battlefields of the Somme and Verdun are peaceful green fields. The trenches have eroded and the barbed wire has rusted away. But if you walk through the cemeteries and read the dates on the headstones, you can see the shadow of the machine gun. Rows upon rows of men who died on the same day in the same hour. They were the victims of a weapon that changed the world. The echo of that mechanical rattling has faded, but the silence it left behind is deafening. In the end, the machine gun did not just define the brutality of trench warfare, it defined the 20th century. It shattered the old world order and paved the way for a new, more cynical era. It forced humanity to confront the terrifying reality of its own destructive capabilities. The weapon that was born from a desire to make war more efficient succeeded only in making it more horrific. As we look back on history, we must remember the lesson of the machine gun. Efficiency in slaughter is no victory at all. The story of the machine gun is a warning about the unintended consequences of innovation. It began as a clever mechanical puzzle and ended as an instrument of mass sorrow. The soldiers who faced it in the mud of Flanders were the first to understand the true cost of modern war. Their sacrifice serves as a permanent testament to the brutality of the conflict. The machine gun remains one of the most significant and terrible inventions in human history. As the sun sets over the former battlefields, the shadows lengthen across the scarred earth. The physical scars of the trenches are slowly healing, but the historical scars remain deep. The machine gun forced a generation to hide in the dirt to survive. It stripped war of its glory and left only the raw, ugly business of killing. It was the weapon that broke the spirit of the old world. And in the quiet of the evening, if you listen closely to the whisper of time, you can almost hear the ghost of that terrible rhythm. The machine gun transformed the soldier from a warrior into a technician of death or a target. It removed the personal element of combat and replaced it with distance and volume. The man pulling the trigger did not need to aim at a specific individual, only at a zone. This depersonalization of killing was a harbinger of the modern age. It allowed for destruction on a scale that was previously unimaginable. The machine gun was the first step toward the automated warfare of the future. We must also remember the engineers and factory workers who built these weapons. The war effort mobilized entire populations to produce the ammunition and guns needed for the front. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers to keep the assembly lines moving. The machine gun was not just a weapon on the battlefield, it was the product of a total war economy. Every bullet fired was the result of a massive industrial chain that linked the home front to the trenches. The tactical stalemate of the Western Front was a direct result of the defensive superiority of the machine gun. It took 4 years and millions of lives for offensive tactics to catch up with defensive technology. The tank, the airplane, and the infiltration squad were all responses to the problem posed by the machine gun. This dynamic of measure and countermeasure continues to drive military development to this day. The machine gun was the catalyst for a revolution in military affairs. In closing, we are left with the image of the lone machine gunner watching over no man's land. He is a symbol of the power and the tragedy of the Great War. He holds in his hands the ability to stop an army, yet he is trapped in a hole in the ground. He is both the master of the battlefield and its prisoner. The machine gun gave him power, but it took away his humanity. It is a weapon that defined an era, and its legacy endures in every conflict that has followed.